May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you in your sight, O Lord. Amen. Please be seated. I volunteered to participate in this series as a learning experience. I really knew very little about Mary when I started. I knew she was the mother of Jesus, but I really didn't know very much about her at all. And as I've been preparing, it's been a real roller coaster ride for me in terms of this learning. I've gone back and forth in terms of how I see Mary. Now, Mary's been a focus of the development of church teachings, and there's been a lot of debate over the years about Mary. Mary's role and status varies widely by Christian religions. Clearly, there's a lot more emphasis on Mary in the Catholic Church than in Protestant churches. The interpretation of Mary has changed significantly over time, and there's been much written by various experts that amplify Mary's role or decrease Mary's role and importance. It's also important, though, to remember that Mary is just not in the Christian religions. For indeed, in the Quran, there's a reference to Mary as the mother of Jesus and as her being a virgin. So it's not just a Christian, Mary isn't just a Christian or important in the Christian church. As I prepared my homily tonight, six things kind of struck me as interesting when I think about Mary and my situation. So, Mary was a teenage woman. I'm a gently aged man. At least I think so. Mary lived in a predominantly Jewish society. I live in a Christian community, and I'm only marginally aware of Judaism and Jewish customs. Mary lived in a rural society over 2,000 years ago. I live in an urban community in 2020. Mary lived in a society where communications options were very limited. Today, I live in a world where the options to communicate with people around the world are at everyone's fingertips. Mary lived at a time when there were no services for unwed mothers. Today, there are support services in place if a woman so chooses. Mary lived in a Jewish community at a time when the rules of society were very important. Today, we live in a world that the rules are often not generally accepted and indeed are regularly broken. I'll leave the comparisons at that for now. In looking from the reading from an overall perspective, Matthew's version is really the story from Joseph's perspective, whereas Luke has written about Mary from Mary's perspective. This is very different. Mary is not the central actor in the story we've heard tonight. The story we've heard tonight is about Joseph. I call this reading the Christmas story a la Joseph. Now, what do we know about Mary based only on this chapter in Matthew? We know, one, that she's engaged to Joseph. Two, we know that Mary and Joseph had not had sex. We know that Mary is Jewish and comes from the line of David. Now, it's interesting, the one thing I did find out as I did some research is that normally in the Jewish tradition, a person's lineage comes from the father, not from the mother. So the gospel writer in this case had to go out of his way to establish a connection for Joseph, although he was not the biological father, but he also had to establish a connection to the house of David for Mary, because she indeed would bring Jesus into the world. So the writer, this is very untraditional in the Jewish community based on my understanding. Now, I have to say that originally when I started all this, I thought that Mary's virginity was a really important question. But having thought about it and listened to our discussions over the last couple of weeks, I now see that as really not very important at all. Whether she is a virgin or not does not impact what she did or who Jesus is. Now, in a Jewish society of the day, marriages were normally arranged by parents. The couples did not date, and normally they did not have a say in who they would marry. Also, the vast majority of Jewish women were engaged by the time they were between 12 and 15 and married about a year later. The marriage process was 2 steps. The engagement was announced, and up to a year later, a wedding feast would be held for the formal completion of the wedding. The year between the engagement and the wedding was a time for the couple to get to know each other. It was not until they were married that they would move into the husband's home. So given the communications of the day, I think we can assume that Mary and Joseph lived in the same community or relatively close to each other. There are some authors who have suggested that Joseph was Mary's guardian, as Mary was an orphan. Others have suggested that Joseph was much older than Mary and had been previously married. This explanation is used so that the later references to Jesus' brothers and sisters can be explained away and allow Mary to be a perpetual virgin. In some Catholic writings, it's also stated that Mary indeed was also conceived by immaculate conception to make the mother of Jesus even purer. Now, other than the normal custom of the day, we really don't know much more about Mary's age, except it's likely she was between 12 and 16. Now, I know it was the custom of the day, but I still find it hard to think that someone slightly older than Cecilia, Phoenix, or Hannah here could be getting married and had to make the decisions that Mary faced. As another aside, I find it interesting that Matthew tells us in detail about Mary's lineage in order to establish that link to the house of David. Now, he doesn't really tell us anything else, though, about Mary's life. So there's all this speculation about, Mary's situation and whatever that are just there. Now, in fairness to the gospel writer, the point of the story isn't to tell all this background information. The point of the story is to establish that Jesus was a Jew, connected to the house of David, and to reinforce the link between Jesus, the Jewish text, and the traditions of the Jewish community at the time. Because what the gospel writer was doing was he wanted Jewish people to convert. So he had to do all of those things in order to get the Jewish community to consider this story. Now, going back to Mary being engaged. So I thought about it and I thought, well, if I was engaged to someone and all of a sudden they found themselves pregnant, I would hope that she would tell me that she was pregnant. I also know that it would be a big stretch for Mary to tell a man that she may or may not know very well that she was pregnant. But it was okay because it was by immaculate conception. It wasn't by the normal means of conception. Now, last week in our discussion, we talked about Mary going to visit Elizabeth for 3 months. And this, I assume, is at the beginning of her pregnancy. This would normally be a time when Mary and Joseph would be getting to know each other. Mary chose to be away. Did she go for support from Elizabeth? Did she go to avoid having to tell Joseph that she was expecting? Does she think that Joseph would not believe her? What does it say about their relationship that she did not talk to Joseph about her situation? Did she tell her parents? Did she go simply to allow God to have time to work things out? I don't have the answer to those questions, but I find them interesting. As a young teenager, I'm sure that the situation was mind-boggling for her. Here she was expecting. She was to be the mother of the Son of God. She lived in a community that clearly did not condone premarital sex. How would that community react to her expecting before she was married? These are only a few of the things that must have gone through her mind as she weighed what was going on. Now, despite all the possible consequences, Mary was obedient to God's wishes. Mary obviously trusted God and that God would work out the situation. So Mary understood the consequences of her expecting and being unwed, but she still accepted God's direction. Now, based on the gospel, Joseph was described in early versions of the text as a righteous man. That is, a man who lives by God's law. The New King James Version of the text describes Joseph as a just man. That is, one who would not only be righteous, but also merciful. Now, Joseph had decided that he would quietly dismiss Mary once he knew that she was expecting, because he knew that he wasn't the father. So it might be natural that Joseph would feel betrayed by Mary, this woman who he'd been engaged to. So we have the angel come, and the angel comes and tells Joseph, don't worry, everything's okay. Mary is still a good woman. She's someone, what has happened is part of God's plan. And as part of God's plan, we heard tonight, here's what you're to do, what the angel told Joseph. Now, Joseph acted very quickly on that direction from the angel. And so as Mary, Joseph was also very obedient to God. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I have trouble figuring out what God is saying to me or what God wants me to do. And I think it would be a little bit easier sometimes if God would come and send an angel to visit and say, here's what I want you to do. Now, of course, you have to recognize that it's actually an angel that's telling you this. The other problem with having an angel come could be that what the angel asked you to do, you don't want to do. And that's kind of a difficult problem. So Mary dodged a bullet when Joseph said yes. Because if Joseph had dismissed her before the wedding ceremony, Mary could have been charged with adultery. The penalty for adultery was either being whipped or stoned. So, in other words, she would have been considered as damaged goods, and in that society, she would have been doomed to life as a single woman and a single parent. Her prospects for life would not have been good, even if she had avoided the charges, because in all likelihood, she would have been shunned by that community because they would have perceived that Mary had broken the rules. Mary was very fortunate that Joseph believed the angels and acted accordingly. Now, Joseph's decision to accept Mary is an acknowledgement, although he's not the biological father of Jesus, that he will be the father of Mary's child. I'm certain that for Joseph, this decision would not, I'm certain that Joseph's decision would not have been well received in the Jewish community if it was known that he was not the father. Based on the readings I've done, accepting, quote unquote, someone else's child was seen almost as a sin. So Joseph's decision to do what he did was indeed a very brave one. Now, both Mary and Joseph were very fortunate that they acted according to what the angel asked, because it allowed them to move forward in their life together. Now, there's a lot of other things written about the fact that, Mary and Joseph could have been shunned from the temple and not allowed to go to worship if it was found out that Joseph was not the father of the child. It was, there are other things in terms of social sanctions, in terms of being involved with community events and things like this. So this could have been an extremely stormy time for both Mary and Joseph, but both acted in accordance with God's wishes. Now, Mary has been glorified for her decision to allow her womb to be used by God as a receptacle for his son. Somehow or other, Joseph doesn't get the same degree of recognition for agreeing to marry Mary. Based on how this story evolves, Joseph did not tell others that he was not the father of Jesus. Joseph's devotion to God and his willingness to go against the tide is very commendable and indeed allows this story to continue. Joseph had nothing to do with creating this situation, but he stepped up to the plate to act when called upon. As we know from other scripture, Joseph treated Jesus as his son. The community knew that Jesus was a remarkable boy and wondered how he could be the son of a carpenter and have the knowledge that he had. We learn that from the stories of his teaching in the temple. Now, I don't know how many of you know it, but St. Joseph, what do you think he's the patron saint of? He's, in the Catholic Church, he's the patron saint of workers. Now, I would put in a vote that based on Joseph's action and that, he became the father for Jesus, even though he wasn't the biological father. A wonderful model of fatherhood, and I think he should become the saint of fathers. Now, I focused up to now about the story in the gospel and its relationship to the church and teachings. But Mary's significance actually goes far beyond the church. She's impacted the secular world as well. In the game of football, there is a pass known as a Hail Mary. And it's normally a long pass near the end of a game made in desperation with little chances of success. But there is faith that it will work. Now, this comes from a football game back in 1923. The University of Notre Dame, a well-known major Catholic university in the United States, was playing Georgia Tech in what was the equivalent of the college championship of the day. The game was not going well for Notre Dame at the beginning. They had four particularly outstanding players on the Notre Dame team. They were called the Four Horsemen. They convinced the team to go into a huddle and to pray to Mary. On the next play, they scored a touchdown. Later in that same game, they did the same thing again. They scored another touchdown. And that was when the word a Hail Mary got associated with football. They went on to win the game and indeed to establish themselves as the preeminent college football team of their day. In 1975, the Dallas Cowboys were playing an important playoff game, and their quarterback, Roger Staubach, threw a pass at the end of the game to win the game. In an interview immediately after the game, he referred to the pass as a Hail Mary. Roger is not a Catholic. Now, there's also the Beatles song, Let It Be. One of the lines in the song is, "In times of trouble, Mother Mary, come to me. Give me words of wisdom, let it be." Now, there's conflicting opinion on whether Paul McCartney was speaking of his own mother, who had died when he was a teenager, or of the Virgin Mary. But in either case, there are a number of people who picked up that reference to the Virgin Mary, even in our secular world. I think, in a way, the song Let It Be could be an anthem to Mary's calmness in the middle of crisis. Now, I'd like you to think about something. Here we are in 2020. Let's say that Jesus were to come back to the world this year. How would the story of his birth be told? Who is involved? Is Mary a single parent? Where would Jesus be in the world? Would Mary put it on her Facebook page that her baby was conceived by Immaculate Conception? Would the story be picked up by reporters? Would you and I believe the story? Now, I've come to appreciate Mary's dedication to God and why she is glorified. She listens to God, accepts God's direction for her life, and then moves forward. She appears to be calm in the middle of this turmoil. She is a servant to the Lord. In our world today, being a servant isn't fashionable. We want to be in control. So many of us need to have that control. But Mary believed that God would work it out. Now, in our study of Acts last fall, God chose everyday people to accomplish important things. You know, in Acts we have people who are very human, very flawed, and yet still took incredible action to move God's plans forward. The people in Acts are very accessible to me because they are so human. Some in the church have tried to make Mary into a perfect model, perfect in every regard, pure in every way. That model of Mary is not very accessible to me. But if I focus only on Mary and what she did, there indeed is a person of great personal strength and a model of devotion. She is a person who is prepared to put God's will ahead of her own.